Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour et bienvenue au magnifique hôtel de la place Bonaventure dans le cadre du 30e anniversaire de la conférence de Montréal. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us today in the magnificent Bonaventure Hotel at the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Conference. Joining me today on stage is Monsieur Éric Gagnon, Vice President, Corporate and Regulatory Affairs, Imperial Tobacco Canada. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Also joining me this morning is Dr. Karl Weiss, Professor of Medicine and Chief of Division of Infectious Diseases, Jewish General Hospital. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
So, gentlemen, before we kick off the formal part of the conversation, I'd like the two of you to briefly introduce yourselves and what's top of mind this morning. I'll start with you, Monsieur Gagnon.
Perfect. So obviously, Dr. Weiss and I have a different background, but really happy to be here. I've been with Imperial Tobacco for 15 years, had a number of positions there. And before that, worked for Rio Tinto Alcan for 11 years. Really happy to be here to talk to you a little bit about what the tobacco industry, or nicotine actually, because people think of Imperial as tobacco, but we're also in vaping and also cessation products, and there's a lot of illicit products on the market. So try to bring a little bit of light on what's happening in the industry. Should be interesting.
Thank you.
So, good morning. My name is Karl Weiss. I'm a physician in infectious diseases and medical microbiology. I work at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. I'm also a professor of medicine at Université de Montréal and McGill. And obviously, infectious diseases is a major problem in terms of, challenges to the world. We saw it with COVID-19. But there are other major problem in medicine today. People are living longer. People are also asking for more, and the cost of healthcare is going up. And all of this together, there's a lot of strain now on drugs and medication production around the world. And I'm sure we'll discuss all the challenges here.
Thank you. So, Monsieur Gagnon, I'm going to ask you a question to kick us off this morning. We're talking about nicotine, and there's also something known as vaping. And preparing for the conference this morning, I was wondering, vaping, how is there a way for me to know where does the ingredients come from? What makes sure that if I'm vaping within the tolerances, if I buy my vaping cartridges from one market versus another market? If you could expand on this for us, please.
Yeah, there's a number of consequences of buying illegal vaping products. And Dr. Weiss would know this very well, but there's been an issue in the U.S. called the E-Valley crisis, where consumers started using, where they were, put in their vaping products illicit THP substances, and they ended up with more than 2,000 hospitalizations and 68 deaths. So there's really, consequences in using illicit products when, consuming products. So there's a lot of, obviously, products coming from Asia. And the problem now is as governments are looking into regulating further vaping products, such as Quebec is a good example. So we have right now, a flavor ban on vaping products in Quebec. So basically only tobacco flavors are allowed. And so some of the vape shops in the industry has been selling flavored liquids to put in your vaping products, but these are not made to vape. So these are the types of things that people, when they buy it, they think, oh, that's a good way to get flavors in my products. But it creates probably a big public health issue that you need to look into. We're trying to work with the regulators on this, but that's the type of thing that, when you impose regulation, you need to think about what potentially could happen. And if you're a consumer, you have to make sure that the products you're buying is, approved by not Health Canada, but at least the substances are made to be used in those types of products. So it is a very concern and a public health issue for sure.
Oh, thank you so much. So Dr. Weiss, we're talking about regulations, and I'd like to talk to you this morning about malaria drug. And let's say that, in some countries, it's a disease that's very present. And if I take that drug, depending on where I'm purchasing it, am I protecting myself or not?
So that's a very interesting question. So first of all, one of the things that people have to remember when we talk about, illicit drug with medication is medication are not really illicit. So, I mean, it's not something which is forbidden, and that's already a hurdle because you're not dealing with something which is not accepted by society where you have, for example, laws regulating that it's forbidden. So it's something which is accepted. However, when we're talking about illicit drug, we're talking about low quality drug that have no active product into it. So, when you buy a medication, you buy a medication with something which is the active product into it, which is going to work and do its job. If you take a medication for diabetes and you have insulin, for example, insulin, this is what works. But you have other medication, other excipient in a drug. So it could be bad quality. It could be drugs that does not contain the active ingredient. And so it's different level, or it could be also a drug that is tainted with all kinds of things that has been added into the compound. For example, people can add chalk, they can add a lot of talc, powder, whatever, sometimes toxic substances. So you're not just ingesting the regular medication, you're ingesting something else. So let's talk about malaria. The WHO, the World Health Organization, went around the world. Malaria is still a very big killer. It kills millions of people every year in the world, mostly young people, mostly children. So it's very unfortunate, but also in terms of economic impact. I mean, when you're dealing with people dying very young, these people are not available for a country in the future in terms of its wealth, in terms of producing wealth, inventing wealth, creating wealth. So it has also a very important social impact and economic impact. So what happens with this malaria drug? In many low-level or middle-level income countries, these malaria drugs can be produced by all kinds of actors. They're very cheap. They're on the market for very cheap. And eventually what happens is it's going to be sold to the public for 1/10 or 1/20th of the actual cost of the normal malaria drug, but it will have no impact, or barely some impact. So you can still be sick, not really being treated, thinking that you have been treated. So malaria drug is important because it's mostly in poor countries where people cannot afford expensive drug, but it's also for something which is very acute. So for example, if you don't take your pills for your diabetes, the impact is not going to be immediate. You will have problems maybe 1 year down the road. If you have high blood pressure, you don't want to be treated, nothing's going to happen to you in the next 6 months. But if you have malaria, you're not treated, you can die within a few days. So the impact is very different for this type of drug that are for acute treatments. So we took the example of malaria drug, but we can apply this to other drugs, to any other drugs. And just maybe to summarize it, there are three types of medication that we can consider in the illicit type of medication. There is what we call the recreational medication. So for example, people that will use drugs like Viagra or Cialis or things like this that can be obtained on the black market. Then there is the bulk, like drugs like antibiotics, anti-malaria drugs, these type of things. And then there are all kinds of drugs that are mostly narcotics, things like, Dilaudid, fentanyl, etc., etc. So these are the three different categories that we're talking about here.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Monsieur Gagnon, we introduced the concept of vaping, and you explained to us that some people would put some flavor in it. So I'm curious, in Canada in particular, is there a federal regulation that regulates this, or is this more provincial regulations? So is it like a Canada-wide approach, or is it more like a piecemeal provincial approach? I'm curious about the regulations that regulate this industry.
Yeah, so on the vaping front, it's a little bit of both, but it's very patchwork approach. So some provinces recognize that, first of all, vaping is there at the basis to help people quit smoking, right? It is less harmful. It is a less harmful alternative to smoking. So if you're a smoker, you're better off getting your nicotine from vaping than from cigarette and combustion. So some provinces have realized that for some adults that want to quit smoking, flavors are important, while others, like Quebec, decided to ban because there is a youth issue in Canada with youth vaping. So trying to address that, they've decided to ban flavors. So Federally, we have some regulation in terms of ingredients, in terms of standards, but then provincially, this is where they would ban flavors and others. So it's a little bit of a patchwork approach. And what you're seeing is that there is obviously cross-border products going from one province to another. But then again, because there's no federal regulations, products are able to come in through the border through CBSA. Because if one province is allowed, then you would, let it go through saying that I'm importing it for Ontario, but then you're going to ship it across Canada.
Okay, so this is very interesting. So it's kind of because some provinces are allowing it, from a federal perspective, it can still come in.
Exactly. So that's why, as an industry, you'd rather have federal regulation than and a blanket approach to this, rather than a patchwork approach which opens the door then to illicit in some provinces, obviously.
Thank you so much. Dr. Weiss, you started talking about active ingredients in the malarian drugs. Could you explain this to us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So in any medication, and this is very interesting, there is something called an API, which is the active product ingredients. So every drug has an API. An API is really the basic of everything, and you have to understand the logistics of the production of medication. So, and I'm going to give you a very simple example. Let's say you have a Canadian company that would like to make penicillin. They have to buy the penicillin base, the API, from somewhere in the world. And today, because of what I would call, all the cost associated with producing some of these drugs in the Western world, many of these production, was sent to Asia, mostly to China and to India. So it raises some challenges. The first one, obviously, was the quality of the drug. And very often, there was issue in terms of the quality. So we ended up having drugs manufactured in Canada for which the API was not very high quality and created issues in patients. So, for example, we labeled people allergic to some drugs, but they were not. They were allergic to some garbage that was included up to a certain point in the API because the quality of the production was not as great. So that's number one. The second thing is now with COVID, government realized in many countries, it was a big thing in the US, and I think they did relatively well, to try to bring back some of his API production within the US, because now it became a kind of a strategic tool to be able to produce this medication locally. Don't forget that, during COVID, there were shortages of everything, and suddenly medication that you think are easily accessible and easily available became backorder simply because the active product ingredient was not available. And sometimes we also saw certain things where someone realized in the world that there were the only producer left of one single API. So prices skyrocketed right away because the company realized that you don't buy my API, you have no drug for the entire world. And sometimes this is true for old medication, but, have no patent, lost their patent. Nobody's really interested to produce them because it's very cheap. So all this put together creates this very special dynamic with the active product ingredients, which is a lot more important today, especially in the post-COVID world than it used to be. Sometimes some of these drugs are not very difficult to produce from a chemical standpoint, and then they can be produced in many countries around the world at a very low cost, but also very low quality. And when you're ingesting this medication here, you don't always have the control on what you're necessarily taking. So this is a big challenge right now. There is I would say, a major trend of bringing back the API production in North America or in Western Europe or in Eastern Europe. And I think now it's more a kind of a strategic tool after COVID.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss. Monsieur Gagnon, we were talking earlier this week, and you really got my attention because you use the B word, not the Benoit word, but the billion word. And you mentioned something that Canadian taxpayers or the government of Canada in general might see a loss of $2 to $3 billion per year when there's illicit products as opposed to regulated products. Could you expand on this a little bit? Because the minute you start talking about billions, you have my full attention.
Yeah. So obviously, we're a lot of people don't like cigarettes, and some people would like cigarettes to go away, and the government has the right to do that. So if the government decided to make cigarettes illegal tomorrow, you're looking at around $8 billion right now that governments across Canada are collecting on an annual basis. Our perspective is that even if you ban cigarettes, people are not going to stop smoking. So you're probably better having a regulated industry that complies with everything. It's a highly regulated, as you know, right? Health warnings on packs, the products is hidden from the public view. You have to be an adult. And when you look at cigarettes specifically, there's about 35% of the market in Canada right now that is illegal. And basically this is driven by price, right? So the prices of cigarette is between, I'll say, around 75% of the price of cigarettes is taxes. So either you add the federal and the provincial excise. And so when you look at the illicit market, we evaluate that the governments in Canada are losing $2 to $3 billion on an annual basis. I don't think anybody's going to cry because tobacco companies or governments are losing money. But I think what you need to put in perspective is these illegal traffickers, and I would expect it's the same thing with drugs, they're selling in the back of their car and they don't ask for proof of age, right? So we are often being accused of the ones that are selling to youth, which we don't want. I can assure you that if kids are using nicotine products, my job is a lot more complicated. But the people selling illegal products, they really don't care. So I think, there's a financial impact, but there's also a societal impact when illegal products are being put to the market. And that's around, on cigarettes specifically, that's the evaluation around $2 to $3 billion annually.
Well, thank you, Monsieur Gagnon, because 2 to 3 billion, that's a lot of asphalts on our roads. It's a lot of infrastructure that we could renovate or build new infrastructure. Thank you. Dr. Weiss, as you may know or may not know, I am I sell generators normally, but I'm also the chair of the Security, Intelligence, and Counterterrorism academic program at George Brown in Toronto. So if you don't mind, I'd like to bring a little national security to the panel this morning. We got out of COVID. We're all here today. COVID was difficult. You mentioned some shortages at one point. So I would like to bring the notion of national security and the strategic importance of having medicines in countries, and furthermore, manufacturing the medicines in the country. So like Canada.
Okay. So you said, first of all, you like the word B, and just to go on what Eric just mentioned, the illicit trade in terms of medication around the world is estimated at around $200 billion per year and go up to about 400. And just to give you an idea, the lost revenue probably prevent by the pharmaceutical company the development of about 15 to 20 new products per year. Because don't forget that pharmaceutical companies usually will spend about 15 to 20% of their income on research and development. And it costs about $2.5 billion to put a new drug on the market. These are rough estimates. So probably we're losing 15 to 20 new potential medication around the world every year. So that's number one. Now, in terms of strategic importance of drugs, health is really the key to everything. We can talk about national defense, we can talk about economics, we can talk about production. If you don't have healthy workers going to your manufacturing plants to produce whatever we're producing in Canada, or mining, or working in offices or whatever, and we saw it during COVID-19, then obviously you have a major dent in the protection of your population. I was involved in a panel where we were physicians from different specialties, and we were asked to find the 100 most important drugs that we must have in Canada, no matter what. It was a very difficult exercise because there were people from emergency medicine, cardiology. I was there for infectious diseases. It's like you all want everything because you say, yes, I have a car, but really, I need electric windows too. And they say, no, you cannot have electric windows. Imagine you're in a situation where the only thing you can have is 4 tires and a steering wheel. Okay. And you have to be able to drive with this in all condition, no winter tires. This is like a situation of crisis. And we ended up finding that there are only we were able to have a list of about 100 different drugs that we can put together. But we realized that sometimes when you think about this drug, there's a shortage of this drug in Canada, and it goes on and all the time. So in terms of national crisis, when COVID started, there were medication that we were lacking, and for all kinds of reasons, because they were produced in another country. You're very aware of all the logistical issues around the world, not just this, but transportation sometimes, and we can expand it to all things above drugs. Sometimes it can be like component for nuclear medicine. It could be sometimes, special dyes for radiology, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we need to have like a local manufacturing capability. I think when we talk about drugs, we also have to talk about vaccines. You remember what happened during COVID? I mean, Canada has a big challenge. Among the G7 country, Canada is the only country that does not have a pharmaceutical giant, if you want, like someone like, the Sanofi or GSK or Bayer in Europe, or the Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck type of company in the US. So when you have a crisis of the COVID-19 magnitude, governments get into the fray, and they tell their own companies, now you have to protect our national interest. And yes, you're going to produce, but first of all, we take over, we control, the agenda here, and which is like normal in terms of crisis. So in Canada, we have obviously generic companies that are very good and recognized around the world. But I think we have to make sure we have the capability to produce this drug in the country. Otherwise, in a situation of crisis, it becomes very difficult to depend on anybody else. The other thing I have to say is today with illicit drug, the online pharmacy business became huge, and it's extremely difficult to control what's going on because people can obviously order medication from, online medication, but you have no idea where this medication comes from, where it's manufactured, so it's another, it becomes another challenge here. And especially when you get into the world of, for example, vitamins and supplements, etc. So right now, we all know that, for example, there is a huge black market for Ozempic because Ozempic is a major medication. It's like it moved the GDP of Denmark up to a certain point. So imagine the number of people trying to get Ozempic very cheap on the online pharmacy with obviously very low quality, and you have no idea what various people are getting. So I see sometimes, people, for example, I'll give you another example. I have some of my HIV patients or hepatitis B patients, they take medication every day. And they travel around the world. They go to a place where the medication is being sold at 1/10 or 1/20th of the price here. And they say, I'm going to buy a year's supply of this. And what they're buying is sometimes something which is 1/10 of the value of the medication they're getting. So they're not controlled. And sometimes they might have side effects, like we mentioned before. So that's another challenge too.
Okay. So if I'm a country, I want to have some sort of manufacturing capabilities.
100%.
Okay. Thank you so much. So talking about manufacturing capabilities, we were discussing nicotine pouches. And this is something that is new to me. But I seem to recollect that you mentioned a threshold of 4 milligrams. So if it's inferior or equal to 4 milligram, it's a health product. And if it's above 4 milligram, it is a licensed product. And I don't believe nobody has that license anywhere in Canada. However, on the illicit market, many products are available in the 15, 16, or 17 milligram for the nicotine pouch. And I would like you to talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so let me explain to people. So most of you will probably be surprised, but Imperial Tobacco has launched a cessation product in the market. So we basically recognize the health risks associated with smoking. We recognize that a large majority of smokers want to quit, but it's not easy to quit. And a lot of them have tried and haven't been successful. So we've brought to the market a nicotine pouch, which is a cessation, a natural health product, which is a nicotine replacement therapy. So a little bit like Nicorette or nicotine gums, the lozenges or other products to help people quit smoking. In order to get that license from Health Canada, if you have below 4 milligram, it is a natural health product. If you want a product that is higher than 4 milligram, then it becomes a pharmaceutical drug, which is very complicated to get. We are the only product licensed by Health Canada to be sold in the market. And to your point, there are many, many brands available in Canada that are higher than the threshold of 4 milligram, but that are not licensed. So this is another form of illegal products that is coming in from either the US or other countries in Europe, and that consumer can just buy. But again, you don't know, is the product hasn't been approved by Health Canada. You're not really sure what's in there. So these are the types of things that our consumers are exposed to. But they're very easily accessible, and consumers are just buying it. And again, there's a concern that youth are buying these products because they're not regulated, and nobody's asking if one, you're a smoker, because you should be a smoker to buy it, and two, are you an adult to buy these products? So that's a little bit what's happening with the nicotine pouch in Canada.
Okay, so thank you. So this is like a product to help people stop smoking.
Yes.
Hence the reason why you should not purchase this if you're not already a smoker.
Exactly.
Thank you for the clarification. Doctor, we were discussing many things, and you said something to me, and I want to quote you. So if I'm misquoting you, please jump in.
Okay.
But it was very powerful, and I'd like you to expand on it. The more complex the drug, the less the tendency to copy.
Yes, I mean, it's relatively obvious because when it's complicated to produce a drug, I mean, it becomes more difficult for players that are not really like associated with big manufacturers to be able to bring this drug to the market. So in medicine today, we have what we call biologics. The biologics, in fact, are very expensive drugs. They work very well, and they keep people alive and in good shape, sometimes for all kinds of problems. We think about Crohn's disease and multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis and eczema and all kinds of like problems where it's not necessarily like going to kill the patient right away, but it's going to keep the people healthy for a very long period of time. And these biologics are very expensive. They're also where the major pharmaceutical companies are investing because they're like long-term medication. And they're more difficult to copy because of the, technique and the technological involvement and investment for this. But when you talk about antibiotics, for example, or drugs that are, sleeping pills, these type of things, from a chemical standpoint, it's not that difficult. So this is why the reward and the investment is a lot less for a massive production that can be sold around the world very quickly. And for antibiotics, obviously, which is, by the way, one of the most prescribed drug around the world, because if you look at the global population, almost every single person might end up taking one antibiotic at one point during the year. And now don't think, and people forget that about 80% of the antibiotic, for example, in Canada, are used in agriculture and not for humans. So there is also a huge production of antibiotics for agriculture where, we try to control it, but is there some illicit market here? Certainly, especially in certain countries. And the problem with antibiotics, and I'm sure we'll talk about it after a little bit, is when you give an antibiotic to someone, you basically give it to everybody because you're dealing with bacteria, and bacteria will eventually defend themselves. And there is the whole issue that we can talk a little bit later about antibiotic resistance around the world. And especially if you deal also with the use of antibiotics in the agriculture world, which, by the way, is important. You cannot avoid using antibiotic in agriculture. We are 8 billion people in the world, and if you want to feed everybody properly, some antibiotics are useful for certain things. But it raises the issue of good quality antibiotics, good production, and the more complex the drug, the less interesting it is to produce, and the rewards are not that big. It's also because when you have a more complex drug, it's usually for a smaller market. So, if, for example, you want to sell a drug for people with Crohn's, not everybody has Crohn's. But if you want to sell a drug for a sleeping pill, potentially the entire planet would be interested to have a sleeping pill at one point or another. So it's a different game too.
Okay, thank you so much. Monsieur Gagnon, we talked about provincial and federal regulations, and we're talking about illicit trade. One thing we haven't touched yet is, you know, when those illicit products come in Canada, do we have an idea what it does, you know, to the excise taxes? And we did discuss the 2 to 3 billion, but do we know who can enforce the flow of these products as well?
Yeah, so if we focus on cigarettes, so the product is, we have a very particular situation in Canada. The RCMP estimates there's 175 organized crime groups dealing illegal tobacco, and there's 50 illegal manufacturing operations on First Nations land. So sometimes people think this is a First Nation issue, but it's actually an organized crime issue. The problem with cigarettes is it's evaluated that it's time more profitable than dealing cocaine. And the fines are not really tough. So because it's a legal product, and we were talking about this, because people are dealing illegal product, it's not like you're dealing an illegal drug. So the cost of doing business, even if you get caught, is not very expensive. Although, when I joined Imperial 15 years ago, Quebec had about 40% illicit trade. Ontario was about 50%. And Quebec did very good, introduced very good measure, giving more powers to law enforcement. So basically, if they believe that there's illegal tobacco in a car that they stop or a truck, they can seize. If they seize products, they can sell those products and keep the money to refund their program. So the program Accès Tabac, which then created Accès Alcool in Quebec, Accès Cannabis, is a very, very good program that is paying off. So Quebec is around 15% illicit right now from 40%, as where Ontario did not introduce a program similar to that. And Ontario is still probably between 35 and 40% illicit. So you can see that if governments are willing to address it, there's an impact. Where we still have a really big challenge is federally. The federal government doesn't, recognize their illicit tobacco in Canada. So they haven't introduced anything. And I don't think if you don't have federal leadership with contributions from the province, you're going to be able to address the tobacco illicit problem in the country.
Thank you so much. Dr. Weiss, as you may know, doctors don't like having me as a patient because I bring my compendium with me and then I ask some questions. So totally randomly, I'm going to open this big book and I'm going to look at CPRO. And guess what? I actually managed to find some CPRO this morning, and I have it. So I have a question for you. If I'm a doctor and I'm using this book, and I believe the book no longer exists.
Yeah, you have a piece of anthology here. I mean, it has some value because it doesn't exist anymore. Everything is online now.
All right. Well, I may be dating myself as well, but I say, okay, this is what's going on. I'm looking at the dosage in my book. I send my patient, you said you need the CPRO 500 milligram, for example, for 21 days. Okay? Not that I'm completely making this up. I do read the book once in a while. If I get the CPRO in Canada, and it's 500 milligram that the doctor prescribed, chances are I am getting 500 milligram.
100%. In Canada, the structure is made in such a way, by the control, the quality, if you get 500 milligram, you're going to get 500 milligram.
Okay. I'm not going to name any specific country. I'm just going to say another country. And I'm traveling there, and I need to have my CPRO, and I ran out of CPRO, and they are willing to fulfill my prescription. What am I getting?
So the WHO went to several countries around the world, and there are obviously geographical areas that are more problematic than others. South America, African countries, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, where the quality of the drug varies a lot. And they kind of randomly bought some pills of CPRO. CPRO is a very common antibiotics, very prescribed and very used around the world. Probably more than 600 million people every year around the world take a pill of CPRO for all kinds of conditions. And they measured, they said, I want to buy a 500 milligram pill, and they bought it. They brought it back to labs where they analyzed the amount of active ingredient in each pill, and it was all over the place. Some pills contain about 500, but many pills had from 0 to anything, 60, 75 milligram, 100 milligram, whatever. So in certain studies, up to 40, 50% of the pills bought did not, contain the exact amount that it should have contained. And that's a major problem for antibiotics, because when you underdose people, you favor antibiotic resistance, which is probably the biggest issue for health and for medicine in the next 20 or 30 years. And antibiotic resistance is going to have a major impact, on everything, because I always tell people, if you don't have antibiotics, you can't do major surgery. For example, you won't be able to do heart surgery. You can't replace a hip. You can't replace a knee, because there's a risk of infection. If you don't have antibiotics available to treat this potential infection, the cost of doing this surgery would be too complex. You can do chemotherapy for people with cancer, because chemotherapy lowers your immune system. The biggest risk for people on chemotherapy is infection. If you don't have the right antibiotic, people will die after their chemotherapy. So there are a lot of challenges right now with having bad drugs, especially bad antibiotics. It's not a problem in Canada, except if you start buying your medication online. But it's a major problem in certain countries around the world, and in countries where the population is sometimes several hundred million people, it can be a big problem because the rate of antibiotic resistance will spread very quickly. It's very, it doesn't cost a lot to produce this type of medication, so it's a penny sometimes for a pill, a few pennies when you produce them in bulk. But even if you resell them at 10 times, the amount, it's already a huge profit. And as Eric mentioned, especially for online drugs, etc., I don't think there is any good legislation. So if you're caught, you're not selling an illicit compound. You're selling a medication which is bad quality. So you might get a fine, but that's it.
So, Monsieur Gagnon, just on that, we're talking about online. And I don't know if either of the two of you know, when someone buys some things online, do we know where it comes from, or we have no idea?
Well, yeah, it depends probably on the product, right? But I think the online world right now is very complicated to regulate in itself. So if you're buying vaping product, like I said, a lot of it is probably coming from Asia. The nicotine pouches is maybe coming from Europe or the US. I don't think on the cigarette front, like I said, it's very local manufacturing. So it's very different situation. But obviously, I mean, we've been trying to get some of the platforms that are collecting money from illegal websites to shut them down, right? Because, they operate the Spotifys of these worlds and others. They don't want money coming in and being able to allow that to happen. So that's one avenue that we're trying to work with. But there's very little appetite from the government. And I don't know if it's because we're a nicotine company, and I don't know if the others pharmaceutical company are facing the same situation. We've raised it many times with regulators. It's difficult to get their attention on these types of things. But so we're trying to do our own homework and get some of the players to shut down some of the illegal websites and stuff like that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Weiss, we just discussed C-Pro, and I'm happy to know that if I buy it in Canada, 500 milligram is 500 milligram. I buy it in other countries, it might be 500 milligram, but it may be much lower. So, thinking about this, it's a question popped up in my head. What is the public health impact of substandard drugs?
So public health impact is, don't forget that when you buy a drug, it's not just a drug, it's all the excipients. So, when you buy a pill for anything, you have a lot of things into that pill. You have cellulose, you have excipients, because it's not just the active compound. So and it's very difficult, the more complex the pill, the more difficult it is to control and evaluate everything. And you don't know where all these ingredients are coming from. Imagine it's like a car. What you're buying a car, but you might have a piece of your car which is made in one country, another piece in another country. So a pill is a little bit like this. So does it have impact on patient? Yes. If a drug doesn't do its function, then you're not controlling a disease. If you're not controlling high blood pressure or diabetes or heart condition, your patient will eventually deteriorate. That's number one. The second thing is this drug can have some drug-drug interactions. So if there is something which is not good in the drug and can interfere with another drug without even knowing it, because you might have not the drug itself, not the active ingredient, but if they're filling up the capsule with something else which has a certain interaction with one of the other drug you're taking, you might still have other problem. And finally, the safety of this drug, and we see that quite often, can lead to problem with your liver, with your kidneys. And this is obviously bad for the patient, but in terms of cost, it adds cost to a healthcare system which is already under, some strains right now. So all of this together, yes, these illicit drug, I would say illicit medication type of problem adds a lot of issues on the healthcare system in terms of burden. And this is something which is very difficult to quantify because this is a brand new area. And government in general, even the WHO does not, the WHO does not have a lot of resources, and they recognize this to monitor this type of illicit medication, low quality medication. There was a panel and they took some action in 2013, but it's kind of a very embryonic type of, structure right now. And at government level, they don't have the capability to control, the entire process. For example, that the FDA, which is the American the Food and Drug Administration, but in Europe there is the EMEA, which is the equivalent, or Health Canada here, which is much smaller, but Canada relies a lot, for obvious reason, on the FDA. They can go to plants in certain areas of the world. They can go to Puerto Rico, where there are a lot of antibiotics and a lot of drugs being produced, and they can do quality control. They can visit the plants, but you cannot visit all the plants in certain countries. So the control there is, question mark.
Okay. Thank you so much. Monsieur Gagnon, I have a question for you that may sound like, whoa, where is Ben going with this? But we were preparing and discussing many, many things, and I took a note here. Tobacco trafficking could lead or can lead to human trafficking and can also lead to weapons trafficking. A powerful statement that you told me when we were discussing this. Could you elaborate a little bit for me?
Yeah, we've talked about the notion that dealing illegal tobacco is very lucrative. The RCMP evaluates that the people who are dealing illegal tobacco are the same people who are doing human trafficking, guns trafficking. It's been recognized that the money made from illegal tobacco is also funding terrorism. So I understand that if you're a consumer, you can buy a pack of cigarette in Canada right now for, let's say in Quebec, for around $20. For 20 cigarettes, you can buy probably 200 cigarettes illegally for $50. But you need to realize that money this is where that money is going, right? They're using the same routes, the routes that they bring in the tobacco leaves. That's the routes that they're going to bring in the guns. So there's a lot of impact on society by funding these organized crime groups. And this is what the RCMP has put out a report on the state of illegal tobacco in Canada, and that's their conclusion.
Oh, thank you so much. Doctor, I have one for you. We spoke about COVID. We just talked about financing, many things. From a CDC perspective and the WHO's perspective, what is the next big thing?
So the next big thing is really the risk of antibiotic resistance, because antibiotic resistance is a worldwide problem. I always tell people, if you learn that your neighbor has diabetes, it's unfortunate for your neighbor, you might feel sorry. But if you learn that your neighbor just had a diagnosis of, let's say, I'm exaggerating, Ebola, the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, when was the last time I saw my neighbor? So practically speaking, what it means that people are always worried about infectious diseases because by nature they're transmissible. So bacteria are transmissible. Bacteria travel around the world. So if you have a problem with antibiotic quality in certain countries where you have many people, where you have these huge demographics, then this will translate into bringing these resistant bacteria into your environment. and that will translate into, using more complex, more expensive antibiotics. So it will be like more difficult antibiotics, more complex, more expensive. It adds a cost, it adds burden to the healthcare system. So it's an important thing to battle these like low quality type of drugs. And I think that's the lesson that we should really think about. And that governments now are starting to be aware that, if they don't tackle antibiotic resistance, some people say it's going to be the next pandemic. I mean, yes and no, because it's not a tsunami. COVID-19, I always say, is like a tsunami, this huge wave that came on you. But antibiotic resistance is more like bad weather, where you have a sea with big waves, not a tsunami, but big waves, but for a very long time. So it's not like 3-4 years. It's like for the next 20 or 30 years. In fact, the CDC said that a major threat for humans in North America for 2050 will be antibiotic resistance. And what I said before in terms of, can we do surgery? Can we give chemotherapy? Can we put people on biologics that will lower their immune system? All of this put together. So that's a big challenge for the future.
Thank you so much. Monsieur Gagnon, closing thoughts, closing words?
Well, maybe in 30 seconds, but I think for us, it's just as you realize that the governments are taking steps like, for example, regulating cannabis in order to take it out of the hands of criminal organizations. That's what the Premier said in Canada. On our industry, there's so much regulation that they're driving consumers to illicit. So just realizing that when you take those decisions, it needs to come with clear enforcement plan would be really important moving forward.
Thank you. Doctor?
I think this is the next challenge. If you don't forget that health is really at the core of everything else. COVID gave us a good lecture about all of this. If we want to keep the population healthy, we certainly have to take into account the quality of the drugs, not just antibiotics, everything we're using. And with online, online pharmacy today, it changed like the landscape in a drastic fashion, and we have to take this into account.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure to have this chat with you this morning. Thank you so much for your time and participating in the 30th anniversary of the Conference of Montreal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.